McCartney III is a rather intriguing concept. Coming 50 years after McCartney I and 40 years after McCartney II, Macca decided that in 2020, under national lockdown, that it was time to complete the conceptual trilogy which he'd started so many years ago. And with each album representing such a key milestone in Paul's life and artistic development, I think it's important to understand the history and legacy of the two preceding albums in this trilogy before we attempt to understand and evaluate the capstone of it in McCartney III. So let's go back to 1970. McCartney I came after the breakup of the Beatles. It was recorded secretly with nothing but a 4-track recorder at his home in St John's Wood in London after living in exile in Scotland for a couple of months, attempting to find himself after John divorced the Beatles. And the job that Paul had had for all of his life just seemed to start to crumble away. Perhaps because of this turmoil, McCartney I was characterised by its starkness. It's one of the first real lo-fi records, and consequently it was panned at the time, but in retrospect it's been considered a bit of a pioneering classic, though for me it primarily remains more of an enticing curiosity than it does a classic album. It's a series of small vignettes, no two songs really sharing much of a similar identity other than their production, and it's conceptually uneven, it's ragged around the edges, there's not the hint of the idea of quality control. It's representative of an uneven mental state as Paul began to cling more towards Linda musically in order to try and find himself and his own musical identity outside of the Beatles. But for sure it's charming. Maybe I'm Amazed is wonderful and Junk is simply gorgeous, but Hot as Sun and Valentine Day, to name but a few, just feel more like throwaway demos, historical curiosities, but certainly not great tracks. But then a decade later in 1980, McCartney II came along, and again, Paul was at a crossroads in his career. The Wings experiment was done, it was 1980, and electronic music was really starting to become a thing. The age of the synthesizer was nigh, and Paul certainly threw himself straight into the mix. While McCartney I, you could say, maybe set the template for lo-fi indie rock to come, which wouldn't really reach its fruition until the 90s, McCartney II kind of set the template for bedroom pop. It shows Paul were trying to navigate a musical era which so many of his generation, and even those of the 70s generation, failed to. Even the great chameleon Bowie struggled to navigate the waters of the 1980s, and I don't think McCartney II fares much better. It's even more jagged, even more uneven than its conceptual predecessor. It's certainly a strange album. It has songs which run the gamut from the Muddy Waters-esque On the Way to the dreadful Kraftwerk-inspired Temporary Secretary, which apparently is a song that has subsequently been reappraised with the help of many major DJs as an underrated classic. But for me, I just find the synth loop utterly insufferable, and certainly one of the worst I've ever heard. And while many now love this record, like the first one, for me there's an austere coldness to it which just doesn't endear it to me as much as McCartney I. McCartney I has charm, McCartney II, I'm not so sure, and whilst I do have it behind me there, because I found it for 50p over the summer, I can't say it's an album that I have a great fondness for, but Waterfalls is beautiful though. Okay, where does McCartney III fit in here? Well, it's 2020, and Paul McCartney's reputation has actually grown stronger over recent years, which may sound strange to say for someone as ubiquitously associated with music as Macca, but after being blamed for the Beatles breakup back in the 70s, a patchy solo career for a while, a collaboration with Rupert the Bear, he was considered a bit uncool. John was the cool hip one, George the underrated genius, Ringo, I mean, he was the drummer. But now Paul was no longer blamed for the Beatles breakup, and he's actually considered in retrospect to be the one most in touch perhaps with the avant-garde scene, the most daring and cool. But where does that leave us with this continuation of his most solo of solo projects? So, McCartney III was recorded in his home studio during the lockdown of 2020, and it is written, produced and performed almost entirely by Paul. But this time is not at a career crossroads like the last two. Instead, this comes at more of a crossroads and a juncture for the music industry as a whole, with great uncertainty surrounding how it's ever going to return from this pandemic. But more like 1 and 2 before it, it's an album that revels in its variety. No one could certainly accuse this of being the same old humdrum McCartney as before. It certainly twists and turns in many interesting directions like 1 or 2, with, again, varying levels of success. The one thing I do really want to stress is that it does seem to have learned from some of the key mistakes that I feel 1 and 2 made in some crucial regards. Well, 1 was this series of short, stem-like song ideas. In 3, every song feels fully developed. It does feel fully fledged, perhaps maybe even overdeveloped and too fully fledged, but we'll get to that soon enough. And while 2 was experimental and daring, it often forgot about melodic sensibility or just good taste in music. It could make the listener recoil in horror as often as it could make them pleasantly amused. Whereas 3 experiments and deviates, but within reason. And that's not to say that I don't enjoy a good bit of avant-garde weirdness, but I'm just not quite sure Macca was ever great at being Zappa. His strength is undoubtedly in a sense of pop melody which was unrivaled. But saying all this, that doesn't mean that number 3 doesn't bring a number of new flaws to the table. But let's start on the positives. Let's talk about what this album does well, because there's quite a few things that it does do really well. There are some really interesting songs here. So let's start with track 2, Find My Way, with its kind of modern indie sensibilities and an almost, at least to my ears, slightly Allman Brothers Jessica-like guitar tone at points. It acts as a clear tone setter, with many lyrics seemingly referencing the pandemic and McCartney kind of offering himself as a guide who will help you to find your way through the anxieties of lockdown through this album. It's certainly a bold promise, but it is a song which has a great sense of melody to it. Though the part that I find the most interesting comes just before the 3-minute mark, when you think that the song's over, and then kind of reminiscent of Strawberry Fields Forever, the song comes back in with all sorts of strange looped and maybe even backwards playing guitars and harmonies coalescing in a trance-like way. And though the drum sound is a bit horribly compressed across this song, which does annoy me a little bit, it's a kind of a minor issue. Compression across this album is a bit flawed, but still, it is a good song. But the best song on the album, I think, is the stunning Slidin. I've seen a few critics dismiss this as like Paul trying to do an homage to Queens of the Stone Age, but to me that kind of reveals a lack of listening to anything else fuzz-driven other than Queens of the Stone Age. This song doesn't really sound like Josh Homme & Co. This song is actually very Paul. I mean, it was Paul who wrote Helter Skelter, which before Black Sabbath came along was probably the heaviest piece of music around, maybe other than Blue Cheer. It's got a wonderful sense of freedom to it, Slidin does, just as Helter Skelter simulated the winding turns and childhood exhilaration of the funfair ride. Slidin just feels alive in a way that no other McCartney song has for a very, very long time. It's a deliciously fuzzy tune, and to be honest, it's made me just want him to do an entire album of fuzz rock now, which really wasn't something I thought I'd be saying in 2020 about Paul McCartney. Maybe that's just me being in the minority, preferring Paul the Rocker to Paul the Balladeer. You give me Yesterday and, well, I prefer Back in the USSR. And that brings me to Lavatory Lil. Yeah, there's a song here called Lavatory Lil, and it's actually one of my favourites. It feels so old school. This could easily have been recorded, I feel, in the Abbey Road sessions, and it kind of a part of the Abbey Road medley towards the end of side 2 that was just never quite added. It's got this Polythene Pam sense of alliteration and humour to it, and it's talking about a former business associate who turned out to be a gold digger that Paul really, really disliked. And it's nice to hear good guy Paul just rip into someone in a way that's more akin to something that Lennon or maybe Harrison might have done than McCartney. And it's got these fiery 50s licks that just ooze that Telecaster tone, and I think it's got a great sense of humour about it. I know a lot of people see it as a bit of a silly throwaway, but for me it's one of the most kick-ass songs on the album. But then if we're talking about Lavatory Lil, we can't help but talk about the song that comes after it in the album, the centrepiece of the album, I guess, Deep, Deep Feeling. I think this might be one of the more polarising songs on the album. At over 8 minutes long, it is very long, and it's a very textured song with Very simple lyrics. You are going to hear the phrase, the deep, deep pain of feeling, a lot, like a lot. But it does do a lot of things right. I mean, it certainly deserved to be longer than, say, the typical 3-minute ditty, and the piano chords are spacious and well based around the same core melody for most of its runtime. It does a lot of stuff to kind of chop and change and interrupt the flow in little bits, and it's very unstructured. It feels quite natural, harkening back almost to maybe some of the material from the White Album, close to some of the collage style experiments, but it's definitely got a modern sensibility to it, especially in its production with the vocal effects used in a way that I think is a little bit corny. I'm not sure it really suits Paul's more aged voice, using some more pop vocal effects, but maybe that's just me. The problem is that while it does capture me for the first about 5.5 minutes, I just don't think there's enough substance here to sustain it over those 8.5 minutes. There's even a natural ending after around the 7-minute mark, but then the damn thing just comes back. And while I enjoyed the way that was done on Find My Way, here I'm just a bit sick of hearing the lyrics that go, so intense your heart is gonna burst. Yet again and again and again. The lyrics are quite repetitive here, and for an 8-minute song, after a few times of hearing this, it did start to drive me a bit up the wall. I do appreciate the effort, and I think it's quite an interesting piece, but I've certainly got to give it a bit more distance before I listen to it again, because after a few listens in close proximity, I started to feel a deep, deep pain of feeling in my ears. But as I've hinted at before, the problem of deep, deep feeling, of having songs that are just a bit too overdeveloped and outstay their welcome a bit too much, happens again and again. The similarly titled Deep Down, which sounds a bit like Paul McCartney's submission for NPR's Tiny Desk series, with its kind of chill, laid-back R&B groove to it. It's kind of cool at first, but it's just deeply repetitive, and again, it is a nice idea. There's not much to dislike about the core feeling of it. It's just bloated beyond belief and ends up being probably my least favourite on the album. I just find it hard to listen to again and again. I'd even argue that the opener, which is quite a good song, Long-Tailed Winter Bird, suffers from that again. The main acoustic riff is fantastic at the beginning, brimming with life and energy, fantastic finger work from Paul on it, and then it goes to kind of a slightly lackluster vocal part, but it's okay, but then it just kind of goes on and on and on. And while it is nice to see Paul go with the flow a bit more, and than he would in a more commercially restrained effort, that Long-Tailed Winter Bird, it just doesn't quite do it for me, aside from the Full on the Hill style recorders in the background, which are really good. I like those. But then, to be fair to Paul, these long, winding roads of songs are counterbalanced by some more expected McCartney ballads, like the album closer, When Winter Comes, which I believe was recorded back in the 90s under the production of the late, great George Martin. And it's a delicate pastoral ballad with not really a metaphor to be found. It's very literal. It takes you back to Paul the farmer, found on the cover of Ram, and he seems to be coming back, talking about the challenges of farming over winter, the winter coming, and what he's going to do with his carrots and his sheep, and there's foxes about, and it's simple and it's really beautifully sung. It is a really lovely way to end the trilogy of albums, which began in such pastoral settings, if you really think about it, with McCartney I. It is a very simple album, inspired a lot by his time in Scotland. All in all, 3 is perhaps maybe the most consistent of the albums in the trilogy. It's certainly more immediately accessible and listenable. It doesn't take as many listens to get into it as 1 and 2, but then McCartney I for me probably does edge it. It just has that quaint depth to it, and if you filter through the junk, pun intended, there's some really beautiful, beautiful material there and a great sense of melody. And with this album, it just tips its hat to modern music maybe a little too often, that I just don't find it quite as charming as its more pastoral debut. But saying this, it does follow the convention set by the trilogy of maybe being a curious, interesting, albeit not classic album from McCartney's long oeuvre. I'm not sure that time will be as kind to it as it has been with 1 and 2. I think other artists' lockdown contributions are going to be remembered a lot more than Paul's, such as Phoebe Bridgers' album or Fiona Apple's album. There's certainly something here within the repetition and meandering styles that shows Paul can still produce enjoyable music. It's not Paul's Black Star, it's not Paul's rough and rowdy ways, but that's fine. If you enjoy Paul's solo stuff, there's definitely some good stuff to dig here. but it's not going to convert the unbelievers who believe Paul's career died when the Beatles dissolved, nor, I guess, is it going to persuade those who believe that Paul literally died in the 60s, and this is just yet another album from that imposter Billy Shears masquerading as Paul. But then again, those people are rather strange, and they probably shouldn't be listened to. So yeah, that's my take on McCartney III. I hope you enjoyed. I know that was quite a long review, but I just had quite a bit to say on it. Stay tuned for more album reviews and other music content on rock, metal, prog, blues, all sorts of stuff. This has been The Album Man. Comment, rate, subscribe, and as always, long live rock and roll.